Welcome to another episode of History Now the Future, a show where we take a sharp look at some of the most pressing issues of today, using history as our guide and the future as our destination. My name is Corey Bradford, and a very stark and unsettling reality regarding the 2024 presidential election is starting to set in. You see, originally, this election was going to be a Biden-Trump rematch. A rematch that the majority of the thinking American public did not want to see. This was going to be the ultimate showdown. A fight between the grumpiest of old men. Which one of the delusional, possibly demented, out-of-touch elderly politicians was going to be the least bad for this nation? That was going to be the question on the ballots in November of 2024. But now, we're going to see a very different type of race. A race obsessed with race. The Democratic Party, through a virtual roll call, has formally nominated Vice President Kamala Harris to be their presidential candidate this year. Now, this will become official at the convention here in a couple of weeks. But for all intents and purposes, the race is now Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris. And I don't think Americans truly understand what that means. Now, I used to work in campaigning. And if I put my political organizer hat on and just try to look at all of this objectively, the Republicans should have a layup here, right? All they have to do is stick to economic issues. Stick to the high inflation, stick to the high gas prices, stick to the out of control grocery prices. Now, technically, there's very little a president could individually do to fix those things. But most Americans don't know that. They think a president is a fucking king or something. If the GOP focused mostly on economic issues that are hurting the working class right now, they would pretty much have this thing in the bag. I mean, shit, that's all they had to do in 2022 during the midterm elections. But the problem that happened back then is the same problem happening now. The culture war is getting in the way. Back in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, setting women's rights back about 50 years or so in this country, and that made it where that red wave that was supposed to happen in 2022 was basically barely a ripple. This year, a similar scenario is playing out. Republicans should be able to easily win this thing if they just focused on working class issues. But instead, they're allowing the seemingly never-ending culture war to take complete control of their overall strategy. Case in point, Donald Trump did something a bit unusual this past week. He allowed black women who weren't conservative plants to ask him questions. And I don't think he'll ever do that shit again, because this exchange went somehow even worse than you thought it would go. And you already knew it wasn't going to go well. Trump's appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists' annual convention in Chicago took a sharp downward spiral as soon as Trump took the stage. He immediately began berating ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott after she asked Trump about his past comments regarding black women. But the most revealing moment came when Trump went on a rant about just how black is Kamala Harris.
I've known her a long time indirectly, not directly very much, and she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
Okay, that was a real clip. That wasn't even AI. What are we even doing here, guys? This is what the 2024 presidential election is going to look like. White conservatives having debates on just how black is Kamala Harris. Is she cookout black? Is she BET black? Is she EBT black? What in the actual goddamn fuck is going on here? I also just want to point out that whole exchange speaks volumes about how white conservative men can't seem to comprehend the concept of being biracial. In their minds, you're either black or white or some type of Hispanic or some type of Asian, and there's really nothing in between. Never mind the fact that there are literally tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of different ethnicities and races on Earth, and sometimes mixtures occur. But that concept is literally foreign to most conservative white men. This is probably the reason why they considered Obama to be the first black president, even though technically he was biracial. And speaking of Obama, all of this does remind me of the last time we had a presidential election in which a black person was one of the main candidates. And that was back in 2008. I was in high school at that time, and I paid very close attention to that election. And it's surprising to even say this, but even though Obama was the first black candidate at that level, race was not a central issue in that election. It just wasn't. Now, sure, black people back then were excited to vote for someone that they considered one of their own. But tens of millions of white people also voted for Obama in spite of him being black, not because he was black. And Obama's opponent in that race, John McCain, made the crucial decision to make sure his campaign didn't focus on race. There were moments when McCain could have went down that road, and his VP nominee Sarah Palin almost sort of did at times. But McCain was an honorable man who said, we're going to keep this campaign honorable. We're going to make this about the issues and the policies. And we're not going to tap into that nativist DNA that we know exists in this country. We're not going to evoke the racism and the xenophobia that we know is lying dormant in America just to win an election. Sadly, if McCain had tapped into America's racist DNA, he probably would have fared better in that election. Because 8 years later, in 2016, that's exactly what Donald Trump did. Trump went full speed ahead into that nativism with just a little populism on the side. And it actually worked. But is it going to work again in 2024? The question now is, how different of a nation are we now than we were 8 years ago? We're certainly more racially divided than we were 16 years ago. And some people blame Obama for that, and some people blame Trump for that. But if this election cycle is going to be about how black Kamala Harris is, or how racist Trump may or may not be, then we're in trouble. Because we are facing a lot of crucial, critical issues that will affect all Americans for generations to come, regardless of their skin color or how they identify. And if we all can't come to that realization, this American experiment isn't going to be in the laboratory for much longer. We have a great show for you all this week. We're going to take a look at my trip to the Ulysses S. Presidential Library and Museum. We're also going to take a look at some international stories. But before we get to all that, it's time for Trending Down. Welcome to Trending Down, a segment where we take a look at some of the more trivial topics floating around the internet in the past week. And this week, we start with a story that has caused more online misinformation, more false claims, and more runaway ignorance than any story I've seen since the second McRib farewell tour. I mean, they just keep bringing it back. Anyway, let's talk about a subject that no one cared about a week ago, but suddenly your drunk step-uncle is now obsessed with. International ladies boxing. By now, you've probably heard all the main talking points about this story. At this year's Paris Olympics, an Algerian boxer named Imane Khelif faced off with an Italian opponent named Angela Carina. Just 46 seconds into their match, Carina, the Italian boxer, abruptly stopped the match and broke down in tears. She was simply hit too hard. Due to her forfeit, Algerian boxer Khelif won the match, and that should have been the end of this story. But that's actually when things got very confusing. You see, the Algerian boxer in question has lived her life as a woman since birth, and she's competed in women's sports for years, and she's lost several boxing matches to other women. But last year, she was disqualified from the International Boxing Association due to failing an unspecified gender test. Now, according to some conflicting reports here, this test may have revealed that Khelif was a female with male chromosomes. More on that in a second, but it is important to point out that Khelif was only forced to take this unspecified test after she defeated a previously undefeated Russian boxer, and the IBA is ran by Umar Kremlev, a Russian and an associate of Vladimir Putin. Now, the International Olympic Committee severed ties with the IBA back in 2019 for a number of reasons, and the IOC saw no issue with Khelif competing as a woman as her passport indicated she was in fact a woman. But once word of her failed gender test spread on social media, all the misinformed anti-LGBT bigots jumped on the bandwagon, declaring that this boxer was in fact a man, pretending to be a woman. And they warned us that this is what the liberals really want. They want men beating up women in international sports. Because everyone knows the American left has so much influence on Algerian boxing. Now, all the ignorant back and forth on this story reveals two things. First, it shows that many people will literally believe any fabricated story they read on social media, and they'll happily contribute to the spread of said story, especially if that false narrative reinforces their own biases. But secondly, this story also reveals an aspect of confusing gender issues that many conservatives never want to acknowledge. the aspect of actual, real medical disorders concerning biological sex. Now, we don't know the real details of this unspecified gender test the IBA gave this Algerian boxer. In fact, all they will say is that they determined she had an unfair advantage over other female boxers. But based off of a lot of the evidence I've gathered, this woman may be suffering from a rare condition known as 46XYDSD. Now, for those of you who skipped biology, let's get a quick refresher. Females have two X chromosomes, and males have an X and a Y chromosome. But disorders can occur, and according to the National Institute of Health, 46XYDSD is when a person has the XY chromosomes found in men, but their genitals are incomplete, abnormal, or clearly female. In other words, a person with this condition could be born with female genitalia, but still have the XY chromosomes associated with men. Now, I don't know for a fact that this woman from Algeria has this condition, but that's just one of many intersex conditions that naturally occur in less than 1% of humans born every year. These intersex conditions are very different from being what we know as transgender. They are different from someone being born a man with a normal set of chromosomes and normal genitalia who later decides to identify as a woman. But many trans people do have real intersex conditions that lead them to transitioning later in life. All this to say, this is really confusing stuff for us to even explain. Imagine how confusing it is to live with these conditions. Now, I totally understand the uproar behind the whole trans athletes debate. Obviously, most rational people don't want to see grown men competing against women in sports. But we also don't want to discriminate against trans athletes. So it's a very complicated issue. But the idea that the radical left is somehow responsible for this Algerian boxer dispute is absolutely ridiculous. This woman is from Algeria, a North African Arab nation dominated by Islam. It's illegal to be gay or lesbian in Algeria. It's illegal to get a sex change there. It's even illegal to cross-dress there. Algeria would never knowingly allow a trans woman to represent their country in the Olympics. But they are standing behind Imane Khelif because she is a woman, a real woman with a very complicated and misunderstood background. And the biggest victory here is that a country with such a poor track record with gender issues is standing behind someone who is just a little different from the rest of us. Now, enjoy this picture of that Turkish guy who won silver in Olympic shooting with no real protective gear. Fucking badass, man. I wish I could have spent 5 minutes just talking about him. So a couple of weeks ago, I took a trip to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum located in Starkville, Mississippi on the campus of Mississippi State University. Now, President Grant has a very interesting yet complex legacy when it comes to U.S. presidents. His stock as a president is always rising and falling depending on the times, and a lot of it has to do with what we were talking about at the beginning of today's show, and that's race in America. A lot of Southern white folks don't care for Grant because of some of the more extreme measures he took against the Deep South during Reconstruction right after the Civil War, but he also did more for African Americans than most presidents before or after him, and we don't really tend to talk about that very often. Now, I sat down and spoke with Ann Marshall, the executive director of the Grant Library, and she explained just how this library is preserving Grant's legacy and how they're trying to frame that legacy in the proper context. So one of the things that I've always wanted to do was visit all of the U.S. presidential libraries and museums here in the United States. And I reached out to a bunch of libraries and museums to see if any of them would let me film there. And the first one to reach back out to me was the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum here in Starkville, Mississippi, on the Mississippi State University campus. You know, Ulysses S. Grant is a very interesting president in my opinion. He's a president that arguably should be like top 10, top 15 at least. But his legacy is a little complicated. You know, his first term, well, before he was even president, he was one of the top, generals during the Civil War. And I think his legacy there is probably even stronger than his presidency. His first term as president was a pretty successful one. He did a lot for newly freed African Americans after the Civil War. So he helped create the Justice Department. He was a big supporter of the 15th Amendment, which gave Black Americans the right to vote. And he also basically used the powers of the federal government to essentially stomp out the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. So all good things, right? He really championed Reconstruction after the disastrous presidency of Andrew Johnson. But his second term wasn't so great. You know, there were some economic issues. 1873, there was a little bit of a panic and then a depression that followed. And he was blamed for that, even though it wasn't really his fault, but he didn't respond to it very well. And then, of course, there were a lot of scandals during his time in office. It wasn't really him. It was more like people in his circle doing some corrupt things here and there. But he gets blamed for a lot of it because the buck has to stop somewhere, right? That, along with a lot of lost cause myths that come out of the South, a lot of, Jim Crow Southerners that arise in the early 20th century, start spreading a lot of misinformation about Grant, painting him as a dictator, a tyrant, because of some of the treatment that occurred towards the South during his time in office. But I think his legacy has definitely been rehabilitated in recent years. And so I'm very curious to see what this library looks like. We're going to talk to some of the curators.
People do think it's really strange that Grant's library is here in Mississippi, not only because he is not from Mississippi originally, but also because he actually defeated the state of Mississippi at Vicksburg in 1863. So really Grant conquered Mississippi, so it does seem rather ironic that the library is here. But it actually came to us from Southern Illinois University. The collection that comprises the basis of the library came in 2009. Even though it seems kind of odd that we're here, we always tell everybody that it really does make sense because Grant did have such a huge impact in Mississippi during the Civil War, and he also had a huge impact in the state during Reconstruction. Even during Reconstruction, Grant's willingness to enforce these Reconstruction amendments and policies ran into a lot of opposition. And it's not surprising that white Southerners did not like what he was doing. And essentially what that is passing legislations like the Ku Klux Klan Acts that put federal enforcement. It doesn't leave it up to the states anymore. And also using federal troops to patrol elections to make sure that there are fair and free elections, that everyone feels comfortable to come out and vote. So he gets a lot of pushback, of course, from white Southerners, but something that a lot of people might find surprising today is that he got almost just as much pushback from white Northerners as well, who felt like this use of federal force in a time of supposed peace was overstepping. And so I think in the aftermath of this too, as we see the rise of lost cause happening, Grant really gets attacked on multiple fronts. Both his military acumen, his military abilities come under fire. And so that's why I think for generations, people have forgotten what a great general he was.
Do you feel like in the last few decades, especially with some of the things that the country is going through now, that there has been a rehabilitation of Grant's image?
Yes, I do think Grant is definitely having an upswing in terms of his reputation, and I think well-deserved. And it really, I think, goes to show it's not that people are finding out that he's done things that they didn't know about. It's not that we've been revealing a bunch of new history. It's just that the context that we're reading that history in has changed a lot. And I think we understand now, we're more willing to look and see what African Americans in the South were up against in the Reconstruction era, more appreciative of the efforts to aid them than we were even 50 years ago. People should come visit to look at all of the amazing exhibits that we have about Grant's life and the time period in which he lived. We have a lovely gallery, and we also have a Lincoln gallery that you can look at the same time. And also, it's free, and there are not very many museums out there that are free to visit. So we really hope that people will come see us here on the campus of Mississippi State University.
I want to take this time to thank everyone at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you to Ann Marshall. I also want to thank Eddie Rangel. He was a huge help. Him and Hannah and all of the people there were just some of the most friendliest people that I've encountered in a very long time. Very knowledgeable folks when it comes to Grant and just history in general. And I can't stress this enough. If you're ever in Mississippi, please visit the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum. It's free to visit. It's on the campus of Mississippi State University, and it brings such a crucial yet often forgotten time period of American history to life. So go check them out. Now it's time for some international news. International stories often get swept under the rug here in the US because of all the crazy things we have going on. So in this segment, we bring you some news updates from around the world in just 90 seconds. First up, what the hell is going on in Bangladesh? Bangladesh's prime minister resigned and fled the country today after weeks of protests grew to challenge her 15-year rule. These protests started peacefully because of anger at a quota system for government jobs. Students felt that the system favored only members of the prime minister's political party. But after the prime minister decided to crack down on these students violently, these demonstrations spread to the point of protesters storming her official residency. January 6 on steroids. All of this has led to some of the worst violence Bangladesh has seen in more than 50 years. And with the prime minister essentially resigning while economic issues worsen, this country is likely to see more chaos before things improve. And this is technically another international story because it involves Russia. 3 Americans and a permanent US resident have been freed from Russian prisons and returned to the US in one of the largest prisoner swaps between Russia and the US since the end of the Cold War. One of the freed Americans is Paul Whelan, a former U.S. Marine accused of espionage in Russia who was sentenced to 16 years in prison there. He was convicted back in 2020 and he served 4 years of his sentence before the Biden administration could secure a deal for his release. Now, it's a great thing that these Americans are now home, but who exactly are we releasing them for? 2 years ago, WNBA player Brittany Griner was famously released from a Russian prison in exchange for Victor Bout, one of the world's most dangerous arms dealers. Russia has been accused of arresting Americans in Russia on flimsy charges just to secure the release of far more dangerous criminals jailed here in the US. Alright everyone, thank you again for watching another episode of History Now the Future. I got a couple of quick shout outs I want to give here at the end. Thank you again to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and Museum for letting me film there. I also want to thank Knopf Doubleday. They actually sent me a collection of some of James Baldwin's greatest works to celebrate his 100th birthday. Born on August 2nd, 1924, James Baldwin would go on to be one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, one of the great black writers, one of the great LGBT writers, a great spokesperson for the civil rights movement. And if you don't know much about James Baldwin, I suggest you go look him up and go read some of his works. Just a brilliant mind for his time. Now, on this week's interview episode coming out Thursday, I sat down with comedian, actor, and content creator Kev on Stage. Now, Kev on Stage is one of the funniest and most prominent comedians working on social media today, and he was actually one of the first stand-up comedians that I saw who was translating well to social media early in his career. I had a great conversation with Kev on Stage, and we talked about everything from how he got started in stand-up to how he translates his comedy so well to social media. He basically gave me a master class in comedy. Make sure to check out that interview episode with Kev on Stage this Thursday, and make sure to like this video and subscribe to the page so you never miss an episode. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you all next time.